Okay, so you are here at the YANA evening tea. We haven't done one in a while. This is terrific. I am very happy to have with us Professors Emily Gold Waldman, who's Yale class of 99, and Bridget Crawford, my class of 91. They are both law professors at the Elizabeth Howe School of Law at Pace University in White Plains, New York. Hey, Bridget, I think that's you. Would you mind muting yourself, or both of you? Awesome, thank you. They are, as we said, law professors and also authors of a new book, Menstruation Matters, Challenging the Law's Silence on Periods. Emily's scholarship and teaching focuses on education law and constitutional law. This is just some of their areas. And Bridget is a tax, trust and estates, and feminism law professor, and also one of the very few Pace University distinguished professors. They are both highly regarded in the academic field by their peers and their students, and they're just both incredibly thoughtful, nice, engaging, smart Yaleys and women. So I hope you're going to enjoy this conversation as much as I know I will. Before we begin, I do want our listeners and people to understand that this particular conversation will have much further implications than just this particular topic. For those of you who are interested in gender and sex discrimination, constitutional equal protection, the environment, public health, workers and labor rights, poverty and disenfranchisement, racial and economic equity, public education, cultural taboos, bullying, mental health, consumer rights and product safety, and tax and fairness, any and all of those, then this discussion is actually going to be for you. Because we're going to cover the history and aspects of what's known as the menstrual advocacy movement, and certainly get some insight and information about what is the tampon tax, what's period poverty, and covering and discussing the rights of people who menstruate. But I do hope we'll also learn that through this particular topic, that there really are many possible legal and private legal partnership avenues through which individuals, government participants, and nonprofit organizations like us can pursue to help address the many larger issues that are close to our own missions. So as the authors closed out their book, and I would highly recommend reading it, menstruation is a threshold justice issue. So I think that really kind of sums it up. You have their bios, their links are available on the Pace Law School website, so I don't want to spend too much time. I want to kind of jump right in. Bridget and Emily, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Really happy to have you here, and so quickly as the book just came out. Tell us, how did you each, and you both become so interested in this particular topic and then compelled to write a book on the whole book on this particular topic? Just maybe we'll just start with that.
Well, I think the last thing either of us ever thought we would write would be a book about menstruation. But I started looking at issues of taxation and human rights. I'm a tax lawyer by training and was interested in the way that tax economics, tax exemptions are related to human rights. And the more I poked around, the more I kept stumbling across this issue of the sales tax imposed on menstrual products. So one day, as we do at our nonprofit, Pace University, and as many nonprofits do, we had a workshop where we were just sharing ideas. And I presented my preliminary work on why tax is a human rights issue and why we should look in particular at the tax on menstrual products. And I mentioned that there was a class action in New York State brought in 2016 challenging the sales tax. And Emily asked me, well, what exactly is the basis for the tax? And we kept talking from there.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I was intrigued. So Bridget mentioned that it was actually being challenged under the United States Constitution, that the argument was that the way that New York State was taxing menstrual products, i.e. that it was putting sales tax on them, even though it was exempting certain other products like Band-Aids, the argument was that that was an equal protection violation. And I was very interested in that. I'm someone who teaches con law. The law is complicated in terms of how you think of these sorts of claims. If it's a straight situation where government is treating men differently from women, the Supreme Court has made clear what we do with that, right? That's like a facial sex-based classification. It triggers a higher level of judicial review. But when you get into these things that aren't quite as explicit as we are treating men differently than women, but we're treating menstrual products, which are very linked to female biology, differently, how do you think about that? And so we decided to write an article really sort of exploring that and making the argument that it could be seen as unconstitutional. We worked on that article. We had a great time working on that article. We then worked on some other articles involving statutes like Title IX and do schools need to provide menstrual products to students who can't afford them? Is that part of their obligation under Title IX? And as we worked more and more, it started seeming like there was a book there. And so that is how the book developed. It was from getting deeper and deeper into the issue and seeing that it cut across so many different areas: tax, education, employment law, questions with employment law, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I came up with my opening, basically trying to think about all these different areas you touched on, and how that approaches. I'm like, wow, I mean, a lot of these things could be done in maybe not tax, but in areas and environmental issues or things that touch on so many issues of equality and things like that, and gender and such. Let's, maybe you've started to hint at that, but like in the topic you chose, menstruation matters. Now I'm going to take a leap of faith, and perhaps did you borrow that from the estimable Dr. Cornel West and his race matters and democracy matters, or how did you come up with that title? And then why does menstruation matter? You talked a little bit about the specific, but outside of just this particular issue, why does this issue matter?
So we claim no particular antecedent for the title, but rather enjoy the play on words of all things related to menstruation, therefore matters of menstruation, and that menstruation matters a lot in the sense is significant for everybody in for vast numbers of years of their lives. So obviously the first issue is really tangible and specific. People who menstruate are going to have not only the outlays of money for menstrual products themselves, but the additional tax on top of it. Generally speaking, this is a rough generalization of the tax systems of 50 states. There are, of course, some states that don't have sales taxes. Taxes break down into sort of all products that are taxed, except those that get a specific exemption. And those more or less map onto necessities and non-necessities. And we just thought it was absolutely absurd that menstrual products were subject to taxation. So I think the question is not in what way does menstruation matter, but rather in what way does it not matter? Because if you can't afford menstrual products, you can't engage in public life. You can't leave the house to go to work, to go to school. You can't concentrate at school or at work. We cover cases in the book of women being fired from their jobs for bleeding on the chair or the carpet unexpectedly at work. What does it mean if we live in a society where prisoners are denied the basic rights to health and hygiene without access to menstrual products? What about these products that we use on or in our bodies for huge numbers of days of the year, years of our lives? How safe are they? And what happens when we throw them away? So instead of maybe why menstruation matters, it's in what universe does it not matter?
Does it not matter? Emily, what would you take on that? And maybe we could start with the since you're a constitutional lawyer. What was let's start with maybe with the class action lawsuit, since we're kind of starting with the tax thing. Like, so what is the premise? How does someone figure out that, like, well, you guys were doing your research, someone else clearly had realized that there was some kind of injustice someplace and figured out from a legal standpoint how to maybe start making that happen. You want to talk a little bit about what that class action was here, and then maybe at that time, I know the other things were going on in other countries, because it's obviously not just an American issue, it's a worldwide, global issue. And you very interestingly, and this is why I recommend reading the book, have talked about some progressive countries like in Scotland and even Kenya, right? And some particular stories that kids and women have to deal with there. And it's, you know, it's an eye opener. You think about it, but when we get to the silence issue, it's that it's not actually something, you know, we actually think about it, or maybe why there's been so much silence in the law. It's like, well, we just don't really, it's like, well, something you have to deal with. And then thank goodness there's people like you and the bringing action saying, wait a minute here, look what's actually going on. So Emily, why don't you talk a little bit, however you want to go with that.
Okay, so first of all, with New York, the interesting thing in New York was that before this lawsuit, menstrual products got classified along with things like douches, like things like that, that were not really necessities in the same way. It was grouped in with those sorts of things menstrual products were grouped in with those sorts of things as opposed to being grouped with just other things that absorb blood, like bandages, which were tax exempt, right? So they got put in this category of things like douches where you still had to pay sales tax rather than being grouped with bandages where you didn't.
And just quickly, like for people who aren't lawyers, like where is this like how do you know that the category it falls into? Where are you looking? Where do you find these things?
So New York State, and I forget, Bridget can jump in and be even more specific, but New York State, it is in writing what classifications different goods have in terms of are they tax exempt or are they not? Bridget,
okay,
add to that.
That's absolutely right. So everything is taxed unless it makes it onto the exempt group in the same way that a nonprofit organization is presumed to be taxed unless it receives a formal tax exemption. So same idea, but there's the silence issue again, because if the law is being made at a time when menstruation wasn't considered a proper subject for polite conversation, the products are never going to make it onto the exempt list. So we don't think there was some grand scheme to shake women down for extra tax money, but it's part of that legacy of shame and stigma that these products never got onto the exempt list.
Sorry, Emma.
It's interesting. I'll just say I was at an exhibit recently up at Radcliffe, which looks at the advertising for old menstrual products. And you can sort of see how way back when they did get grouped with things like douches because there was so much of an emphasis on menstruation as being unclean, right? And that these products were sort of securing people's cleanliness. So you can see how they would have gotten classified not as just basic necessities, but as this sort of thing that women needed to do on the side to, you know, preserve their cleanliness or something like that. But anyway, getting back to the lawsuit. So just to skip to the end, what ended up happening was the lawsuit never reached a judicial ruling because New York State decided to lift the tampon tax. So there was never actually a court ruling on, well, what if that hadn't happened? Was what New York State was doing unconstitutional or not? So that was sort of the starting point for the article in terms of what are the arguments you could make that it is unconstitutional. And for people on this who aren't lawyers or want a little refresher, the way that equal protection thinks about these things. So when you're thinking about a law that has to do with sex or gender, as I mentioned, if it on its face is classifying, it's saying we're treating men and women differently, right? Like men can do this, but women can't, or vice versa. Then courts look pretty closely at that. They apply what's called intermediate scrutiny, where the government has to show that that facial differentiation is substantially related to an important governmental interest. On the other hand, suppose you just have a law that has what's called a disparate impact on women. So on its face, it's not talking about women, right? But imagine a law that said you need to be 6 feet tall to do a certain job, right? And that would have a disparate impact on women relative to men. So the Supreme Court has said that actually they've made it very hard to win those sorts of cases because not only do you have to show that there's a disparate impact, but you have to show that the government's intent was to have that impact. Not even merely that the government or legislators knew that it would have that effect and they went ahead anyway, but actually that that was their goal. There's this very famous case from 1979 called the Phoeni Case, where Massachusetts had a veterans preference statute. And at the time in 1979, the vast majority, even today, but more so then, vast majority of veterans were men. And it was shortly after the Vietnam War. So about 25% of the workforce were men. So giving veterans preference had an enormous disparate impact on women. And yet the Supreme Court said, we're not going to review it with this higher level of scrutiny unless we can show that the government wanted that result. So the question here, it's sort of a puzzle. Like, how do you think about this treatment of menstrual products, that you're exempting, say, Band-Aids, but not menstrual products. Can you analogize that to facial classification? Because menstrual products are so tied to women that that can be seen as treating women worse. Or do you see it as a disparate impact where then you also have to show intent? What we argued in our article and what we talk about in the book as well is really this kind of bridges the divide, something like this, right? It's not literally a facial classification based on sex, but it's very, very close. You can see menstrual products very much as sort of a proxy for that. And then we say, even if you don't buy that, you do look at this through a disparate impact lens. Bridget alluded to this before. While we're not prepared to say that government was trying to hurt women, we do think that this failure to exclude menstrual products when other products are being exempted, like other blood absorbent products like bandages, it comes from a certain sort of animus toward menstruation that maybe isn't spoken, but just sort of not wanting to deal with it, not wanting to think about it, that it's connected to that sort of thing, whether consciously or not, and that should be enough. So we argue that either theory it should work, but again, at least in New York, the court never reached that issue. There hasn't been a court that has like affirmatively blessed that argument.
And in the meantime, you have a list, or at least you've referenced places where there's, I mean, how many states actually have how many had taxing them in the first place? And let's start with that. And then of those, how many actually repealed it?
Long story short, we're down to about 26 that still tax menstrual products. And we started in the high 40s, in the 40s range. So there's been quite a bit of movement. And that's also interesting too. Where does change come from? Obviously, in places like Florida, New York, there was a lawsuit in Ohio, a recent lawsuit in Michigan. There are some people who are taking to the courts. There are other people who are trying to work with state legislators to get the law changed. And I think, you know, wherever you are on the political spectrum, most people hear about this issue and think that's kind of ridiculous because menstrual products aren't luxuries. These are necessities. So most people, Republican, Democrat, somewhere in between, can understand the importance of repeal. We also are seeing activists of all ages get involved in these issues. Amazing leadership from young people in particular, high school students, middle school students holding protests in the form of tampon-shaped cookie sales at their school, high schoolers writing op-eds for their school newspapers, drawing attention to this real and important issue that everybody needs to be able to access menstrual products when they need them, because periods don't always arrive on time, for sure. And for students, that can be particularly tricky because they're not necessarily free to get up and go to the restroom whenever they want. And their periods, unlike adult periods, are even more irregular. So we have particular interest in vulnerable populations like students, like prisoners, detainees, and poor folks, because those are people whose basic human needs are not being met.
Right. So this kind of leads us into like the larger, not just the tampon tax, but what's called the menstrual advocacy movement. So it's not just the tampon tax, right? So my understanding is that it has to do with like the products themselves and not just whether they're taxed, but are they accessible? Are they available? Are they affordable? And then are they safe, right? With all those areas, and that there's no discrimination in how those things or how people who menstruate are treated. Is that kind of let's tell the audience what the menstrual advocacy movement really kind of encapsulates and what its goals are.
I think that's a really good summary. I think you're right that a lot of it has been product-based so far, and that's where sort of the clearest wins have been scored in terms of trying to get the tampon tax lifted in the states that still have it, trying to prompt states to pass laws to require their public schools to provide free menstrual products. Sometimes it's also municipalities pushing them to provide them, like Brookline, Massachusetts started doing that, trying to make sure that prisons are providing them, and not just providing them, but providing them for free. Right. Part of what had been going on was they were actually, in many situations, charging incarcerated people for products, so they were having to choose. They had very limited sort of money given to them, and were they going to use it for a phone call or for menstrual products that they need? So that there's a big product focused agenda, and you're right, it also encompasses health and safety and things like that. Then there's another piece, which so far hasn't scored as many wins, but I think is part of it in thinking about employment, like to the extent that people are discriminated against, might need accommodations related to their periods, might be harassed and things like that. That's a whole nother sort of area to think about. But as we conceive of the whole thing, and we talk about this a lot in the book, the idea is really to make sure that menstruation is not holding anyone back from full participation in all aspects of public life, whether it's going to school or going to work or just participating in society. But the product focus is an interesting one, and we think that's part of why, in a way, it has scored some wins, is there are some tangible solutions that people can get behind, including in a bipartisan way, especially with the tax, right? Reducing taxes can be sort of broadly politically appealing.
Right, and I can see it touches on contemporary issues with respect to people who menstruate, and then where should these products be available, in which restrooms, and it's sort of crossing over with as the other sort of identity and other issues in society are developing, that, as Bridget said, how menstruation matters for everything. And this is just another example. So we've been talking mostly about, well, you as sort of legal scholars, and there's someone else, and I gather some, jurists, and we haven't gotten that far yet, but legislators and individuals who sort of said, hey, this isn't really working, as sort of actors or people who could participate. There's also like private sector. And I guess while we're here, like, what are nonprofits doing? I know that there are some that focus on this issue, but as employers, as mission-driven organizations, what's going on? Who are the other kind of actors in the menstrual advocacy movement?
So the nonprofits that are attempting to provide direct services or menstrual products are hugely important in this space. It's through organizations like the Homeless Period Project, I Support the Girls, and other menstruation-oriented anti-poverty programs that a lot of awareness has come to the forefront. And that's because food banks very often didn't have menstrual products or ran out of them very quickly. That was, of course, exacerbated and made more visible in the pandemic. It was the first time that many people who never thought about the availability of tampons suddenly became more aware of what a scarce commodity they can be. And of course, we're now hearing about a supply chain issue with the manufacture of menstrual products. But nonprofits have been extremely important in both providing direct services and in bringing awareness to the issue. Because in almost every community now, there's some way to get involved in menstrual activism. The intriguing possibility that you've raised, Rachel, is the nonprofits as employers themselves and as market players themselves. As an employer, what kind of stance or policies could a nonprofit adopt regarding menstruation that might help move the needle on the safety, affordability, and availability, sustainability of menstrual products? And we have quite a bit to say on those issues. One very simple thing is to make sure menstrual products are available in the workplace, not in some secret cubbyhole or the equivalent of the nurse's office, but available in the same way toilet paper is available. And in making those purchasing decisions, what kinds of decisions is the nonprofit making? When we got our law school to install dispensers of free menstrual products in the restrooms at school, one of our asks was that they be organic, quickly biodegradable products. And imagine if entire networks of nonprofits got together and said, we're going to provide these products in our workplace, even if we're a workplace of 1 or 2 or 3 or 200, and those products are going to be sustainable products. we start to move the needle a little bit on some of these concerning issues regarding both period poverty and the waste that menstrual products create.
Interesting. And in individuals themselves, this is great. I've seen some comments come up. And individuals themselves, not only can they volunteer, donate to some of these places, kind of get involved as activists. I mean, I love this idea of also kind of thinking about whether it's class action or enforcing the sort of administrative enforcement, whether it's Title IX. I mean, there's other ways, like with your kids are in school, right? Maybe you have college age students finding out, like, what are their Title IX, what are they doing, with respect to these issues on their campuses. I love the fact that you showed some stories in the book of teenagers writing letters to senators or to enforcement. I mean, so there's, like you said, this activism, this grassroots agency, the same way it's done on this sort of it's basically civic engagement, right, for individuals on any issue, for whether it's race or identity or whatever. I mean, this is sort of the same thing if you care enough about it. And because, as you guys point out, it is so tied into all these other sort of constitutional issues and the ability to participate fully in the workforce and society. One thing we haven't touched on yet is maybe like the non-legal, well, maybe it is like the education, right? You said raising awareness, and then also like public service announcements. And then it's still pretty amazing that there's so many girls, I would say, because before they hit puberty all over the world, who just don't have the right facts and they have no idea. And then what roles do governments or families or cultural religions, like what's the education component of this that's going to help move the needle?
I mean, right now, sex education, puberty education, all that stuff, it just varies widely across different states. Different states have different rules for whether it's provided at all, right? Even if it's provided, it's not clear that everything that's said is going to be accurate. One of the other interesting things is often students are divided for sex ed and sort of puberty education, with boys going in one place and girls going.
Not my day. No, Bridget, you're my age.
I think we might have been sex segregated. It very much depends on the local community.
All right, but you're right. So that separates them. So the boys are the ones who are doing the bullying, and right, they don't know idea.
So they're not really here. They have, I think, maybe some sense that this is something that happens, but they don't really learn the details, right? So that's problematic. Of course, then there's also the issue with kids who are non-binary or trans, so then they're not even getting information about things that are going to be happening to their bodies necessarily, depending on how they're classified for those purposes. So having a baseline of menstrual education that everybody has is really important. It's interesting. I think one of the things we're seeing right now with the Dobbs case and abortion too is a relationship between a lack of basic understanding about menstruation and biology in connection with pregnancy. So for example, you see politicians saying, oh, well, if someone's 6 weeks pregnant, that means that they maybe have known for 6 weeks that they were pregnant. If you actually, learn more about menstruation and things like that, you would know that's not the case, right? That 6 weeks pregnant really means 6 weeks from the last menstrual period, not 6 weeks from actually becoming pregnant. So you see how a lot of these sort of failures to really talk about stuff and make sure everyone has baseline biological understandings ends up having all of these unfortunate, concerning political implications.
What about sort of like public service announcements, like governments or municipalities, or I don't even know, when's the last, other than the COVID and vaccine seems to be the most recent one. Are there other sort of similar things that maybe people have tried or?
We haven't seen any sort of government involvement in public service announcements, and I would be surprised if we do, because everything around gender now is so charged. We're hearing about the "Don't Say Gay" laws and rules against doctors prescribing hormone treatments for their minor age patients. I would be surprised if we saw the government stepping in here. But here's where I think that nonprofits that serve any community, poor or not, can play a huge role. If having menstrual products available or information about menstruation is even vaguely related to an organization's mission, that's a huge opportunity for the nonprofit to contribute to the destigmatization, because menstruation happens regularly to half the population, and it doesn't need to be something that's shameful or hidden. We did see during the COVID pandemic, when schools were shutting down, kids were cut off from some of their only access to menstrual products and to menstrual education. And nonprofits were, quite frankly, overwhelmed by the pandemic, completely understandably so, trying to meet the needs, very, very basic needs of people in great economic crisis. So to the extent we can all sort of keep menstruation on our radar screen, I think we help each other.
That's a really good idea. You know, this touches on what the next sort of, I'm going up the chain of issues here, like larger cultural issues, and I can see people's comments and reading your book. And again, this is something it's like, okay, you have to deal with it every month. But then I'm like, wait a minute, like, yeah, I guess I was raised like, yeah, there is this cultural taboo. And so where does all this come from, you know, about menstruations? And is it the same in the United States versus other countries? You talk about some of these other countries where these issues, or particularly as they've been related in the tax law and such, but what's the tension with kind of maybe cultural norms, gender norms, polite company? We don't talk about it. It's but go ahead. Let's talk about that kind of larger issue a little bit. Emily, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think one thing we talk about in the book is you see this sort of across culture. I mean, it manifests in different ways, but a sense of stigma and shame and silence around menstruation, unfortunately, it's fairly universal. We see it in different cultures. We see it across different centuries. And like I said, it manifests differently, but it's certainly not just specific to the United States. If you look all over the world, you see all sorts of different manifestations of it in terms of, you know, people having to sort of be physically separate when they're menstruating, the idea that it renders people unclean in all sorts of ways. They can't be touched. They can't touch things when they're menstruating. I mean, to me, I think what's interesting is this idea in our book of Menstruation Matters. Before really thinking about the ideas in this book, I sort of had two models in my mind. One of them was that society does think about menstruation, but that it's done in a way that's actually limiting to women, right? When I think about some religious traditions and things like all these things you can't do when you're menstruating, that you're unclean, right? So taking account of menstruation, but in ways that have the potential to really limit menstruating people and hold them back. And then the other model in my mind was, well, just ignore it, don't talk about it. But you see in this book that can also hold people back, because if you don't talk about it, then, well, you know, a very like basic level, things like tax exemptions. Well, if you're not talking about it, you're not going to single out those products for the same exemptions that they really deserve. You're not going to really talk about it in schools. You're not going to address the fact that maybe students are showing up and then they unexpectedly get their periods and they're not prepared, so they leave school or something like that, right? You need to talk about it in certain ways. So neither of those models, right, taking it into account to sort of have rules about what people can't do, or ignoring it and not talking about it at all, really gets us toward the ultimate place of making sure that it's not something that holds people back from full participation in public life. So that's what our book is trying to explore, sort of the third idea, acknowledging it and thinking about it, but thinking about it in a way that actually helps people.
Bridget, what about you? I mean, these could be very deeply held beliefs in traditions and all over the world. They come from, you know, these come from somewhere, and it's got to be hard slog. And that may be for everything, a lot of things related to gender differences, or I mean, name this sort of traditional religious, whatever the tradition may be or viewpoint, seeps into laws and civic society and stuff. So how do you, have you seen, like, we studied much, have you talked to cultural anthropologists anywhere around the world? Like, just, I mean, I don't know how deep of a dive you did into the concept of menstruation, how that's been treated throughout religious history and human history.
There are some super interesting cases, particularly regarding religion and menstruation. A fantastic study out of Trinidad involving very aware and educated women who say, we don't want to enter the temples when we are menstruating, because that is our form of continuing our covenant with our God. And so we're not suggesting that anyone should follow a particular matter, a particular path, but rather that the law shouldn't be making those decisions for people about what they can and cannot do based on their menstrual status, or in depriving folks of the things that they need: education, safety, access to products in order to participate. That it really is a matter of individual choice, which we certainly respect. And for many people, that is a very deeply held religious belief. That being said, when deeply held religious beliefs cross over the line into dictating what people can and cannot do because of an involuntary process like menstruation, that's where we're trying to carve out some space and say, that's not the role for the law to restrict people. The role of the law is to increase human flourishing.
Interesting. So we just mentioned a little bit this tension coming against maybe culture and religions. What other sort of tensions are there? There's silence, clearly, just, don't talk about. But I know one you thought was very interesting from feminist perceptions is like, do we go with the equal protection, we don't want to be treated any differently than men, or do we want to be treated the same? And so, I don't know, Bridget, you're the feminist lawyer. You want to talk a little bit about what some of these in the movements themselves, or why equal protection or some of these other constitutional things might come up against a little bit against other social movements?
So I'll start and then pass it over to Emily, because this is something we've both given a lot of thought to. So this is a tension, we're all familiar with it. Is it that we should be treated exactly the same as our co-citizen, or should we be treated equitably, taking into account differences like biology? And failing to take those differences into account can lead us into some tricky situations involving things like pregnancy, breastfeeding, menstruation, and menopause. And Emily really works in this area, particularly in the employment context.
Right, how we think about all of those things. And one of the things that we have worked on and have continued to work on is thinking about menstruation, menopause, pregnancy, breastfeeding, all as part of a larger issue, right, of making it possible for people to remain at work, and noting that a lot of the types of issues come up in all of those areas in terms of discrimination and the need for accommodation. But another tension that I was thinking about when you talked about different tensions, sure, one tension that we had to wrestle with in the book too, is that I mentioned a while ago that one of the really strong legal arguments against the tampon tax in terms of just fitting into existing jurisprudence is this idea that you can see the tampon tax, or like not exempting menstrual products when you're exempting things like Band-Aids, that you can see it as sort of equivalent to a facial sex classification, right? The argument is because menstrual products are so linked to female biology, like a proxy for female sex, right? So that's an argument that fits in sort of neatly, but what do we do about the fact that there's increasing recognition that not everyone who menstruates is a woman? Right? So what about trans men? What about non-binary people? So there's this tension where it's easier to make the legal argument in terms of, well, this is basically like discrimination against women, but then you have to frame it all about women, and then that can end up seeming exclusionary toward people who don't identify as women who menstruate. So we devoted a whole chapter to that. Like, yep, how do you make the argument that works in terms of fitting into the boxes that have already been created, right? Try to make like the cleanest, clearest legal argument, but also be inclusive. And how do you navigate that? That's an interesting tension that I think became even more apparent to us after we wrote that article. We wrote that article, I think it was published in January of 2019. And by the time we were working on the book, just a few years later, already society had changed so much in how it talked about stuff. And
yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting. Getting back to the products issue, I guess I had not really thought about that, is that they're all pink and flowers, right? I mean, and so that's like, I hadn't thought about that, but I guess now there may be people who may not identify as what I would call, a woman going to buy products and they don't want pink. And so, private companies, and I guess all those people are having to deal with these issues as well. which I thought was fascinating. What are some of the companies themselves? And we talk about products. We haven't talked about like who's producing them. I mean, it's a big business, right? I mean, let's talk about some of the practicalities of this sort of menstrual industry, for lack of a better word. What are the main players? What's it like in the United States versus other countries? What's the money? What's the supply chain? All that kind of stuff.
So this is a really important part of the conversation because menstruation is a profit center in so many ways. There's, of course, the menstrual products. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry globally. And curiously, the products that are available for sale in the US are not the same products offered by the same companies in markets in Africa, for example. And that has gotten companies like Procter & Gamble into a whole lot of trouble when scores of Kenyan women, for example, were reporting vaginal irritation from what appeared to be the glue or adhesive used in a particular brand of pads. But what we see companies doing is embracing this "you go girl" feminist messaging in order to create, a sort of halo, a reputational halo that these are sort of pro-empowerment companies. And while some of those companies are engaged in important philanthropy products, their primary purpose in employing these messages are to sell, sell, sell. We take another look beyond just the products industry, the menstrual products industry, at an ancillary burgeoning market in things like period subscription boxes, send chocolate to your preteen every month, for example, or buy this expensive period blanket to have sexual intercourse with your partner on, because that sort of plays into notions of menstrual blood as disgusting or gross, so you need a special blanket to protect your bed, for example. And then once you start talking about profit centers, let's not forget period apps. Period apps where people are voluntarily entering in very important, very intimate data about when they menstruated, when and how, with whom they had sexual intercourse or other sexual contact. And certainly in the wake of the Dobbs decision, I think we've got some views about the wisdom of having that kind of information on your phone.
And what is your recommendation to your students now? Don't do it.
Yeah.
So delete those. And it comes now, it's like an automatic thing that shows up in the Apple app. It's like, track this, right? There's all sorts of things. And who knows what's happening. So now we're also into data privacy issues and potential uses by the government for prosecution and of some of these new laws that are coming out.
And so here again, there's this tension between, we want periods to be normalized so that, yes, it's perfectly normal that it would come up in, for example, the sort of suite of apps that one's provider might offer, that one could monitor one's menstruation in the same one you can, I track my Weight Watchers points, et cetera, et cetera. You want it to be normalized. On the other hand, people are giving away to these companies intensely private data that can be used against them in a criminal action in the future, or it as a possible source of employment discrimination. We know there are some employers that give employees a little incentive every month if they agree to track their periods. Well, why? Why are these companies giving incentives to track their periods? It's arguably or presented in the name of sort of general health management, but it does raise the specter of possible discrimination. And who's making money from these apps? It's not the people on whose body the industry is built. These are for-profit companies who treat that data not with particular care and can get more money on the black market for that data than credit card data.
Employment information. I had no idea, Emily. What is that about? I have no idea. Is that included in some health plans? You
I think it's often it's part of these larger things where like different things you do to sort of think about other like incentives that employers offer in terms of doing things that are theoretically like better for your health and things like that. It's connected to that. I mean, I think the landscape has really changed abruptly in light of Dobbs. Not that there weren't these concerns before, there were, but I think it's a whole new level now when you're thinking about abortion being illegal in some states. And that things like this could really be evident, you know, when you're putting together, well, the person was supposed to get her period and she didn't. So was she pregnant? Like what's going, you know, there's a lot that you can learn piecing that together with other stuff.
That could be scary. And the other thing I had no idea that they were creating products that in your body can have digital and like Bluetooth monitoring systems, and they're not, are they FDA approved? I mean, holy cow.
Yes, so Bluetooth tampons and Bluetooth menstrual cups are not yet big market share takers. But where there is an opportunity, we will see entrepreneurs creating need. I know very few people who have ever thought, gee, I have no idea if my tampon is full or not. I wish I had a sort of electronic monitor. But this sort of creation of the need by playing on anxieties about the menstruating body as something unknowable is part of, you know, this hook of menstrual capitalism.
Oh, I love that, menstrual capitalism. That's another one. So I want to encourage people. I have to say, this is the most chat I've seen in one of our webinars probably in over a year. So we've clearly, and people had a lot of questions and they were conversing with each other. So that's great. If you have specific questions you haven't had answered yet for our panelists, please ask them. And I would highly recommend reading the book. It is really, really, really well laid out. Lots of details and very well, if you're not a lawyer, you can follow it. So I would say kudos to you guys for putting this together and making it approachable and accessible for a non-legal audience. And I hopefully get some good play. I usually like to kind of close out conversations asking nonprofits about what would it take to put you out of business, right? I mean, what would it take to address and solve all the problems that give rise to the need for you to provide services? I think you guys have actually laid out pretty well what needs to be done. So the question is, like, what if all these things were done from the legal standpoint? There were no tax on tampons, everything was safe, everyone who needed it could get it. Like, then what?
Then we still have discrimination based on the other end of the menstruation spectrum, which is that insidious discrimination at the intersection of age and gender, and that's discrimination based on menopause. So we see this continued theme of stigma, shame around issues relating to menopause. And so I think that is what would come after if we could wave a magic wand and all of our solutions came true. But as Lowell Perry points out in the comments, it's not clear that solutions will be forthcoming where there is money to be made on the lack of solutions. So a good insight there.
Yeah, which brings us to bigger society issue is like, what do we value making money off of, and what do we value sort of fighting for? I mean, I have to say, it's maybe my own personal thing is, whatever your opinion is about the Dobbs decision, it is forcing Americans to have to be more civically educated about how things work locally at state levels, who represents, how laws are made, who gets elected, how many women there are. I mean, I don't think I checked. I'm a resident of Texas. You know, there are these things you can say, you can fill out all your demographics, what your gender, age, blah, 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 blah. How many people like you are on your state? Just curious. And then it's like, well, where are the avenues of redress right now? You guys have certainly tax, class action lawsuits. A lot of it is in the government. And then it does, like, we now need a bigger civic education of how we're going to start not only educating people about sex education and menstrual products, but also like who makes decisions about these things? Who creates tax laws? Who creates tax laws, Bridget, and employment laws?
Municipalities, states do, the federal government does. Everywhere you look, there is a law that can be challenged or improved. And nonprofits can be fantastic places for people to come together to brainstorm about the best way to approach reforming law or society, you know, in the way that's authentic and appropriate for the situation at hand.
And I would say our colleague and fellow Yale, Tim Delaney, who is the executive director of the National Council of Nonprofits, and they do a lot of, you know, advocacy and providing kind of best practices and keeping an eye on, I think, all the states and the federal government about where very small things you wouldn't think on their face would affect nonprofits, from tax and things like that. And so that's another kind of avenue that kind of can help bring in, you know, interest in the social impact space and kind of highlight that. But you need that for almost everything. I mean, I just hope at the very least that people will look locally for activism. And, you know, kudos to the students. And I know there are documentary films, there are websites, you can donate and get stuff done. You can do petitions. There are GoFundMe campaigns, right, for some of these projects. I don't know, Emily, what are you thinking? Does menopause is sort of the, seems like, as Bridget was saying, the next one. I mean, what's the difference or the crossover between that and sort of the basic age discrimination thing? What makes it a little bit different?
Oh, so it's interesting because menopause, obviously, piece of it is age discrimination. And then I think it's combined with sex, gender discrimination, and in particular, right, when you think about how they combine discrimination against aging women, and there's also sort of an overlay of disability discrimination too. It's really reflects the intersection of all of those issues. Going back to your other question for a minute, I was thinking about
good.
Like what's left if all the laws could be changed. And I think one of the things that I would really be interested to see is if all of those laws changed, right? So tampon tax and products freely provided everywhere, would that then change the culture too? Would it remove the silence and stigma around menstruation to have these products out there so much? And it's an interesting question. I think at the very least, it would certainly help.
I mean, this has got to be a common theme.
Stigma. Just one culture reinforce each other. So those sorts of changes, hopefully, they don't completely change the culture, but they chip away at it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Just as a lot of laws are initially done, you know, we can get into theories of law. Should it reflect the way, you know, human society is and what the cultural norms and values are, and vice versa, when you have to recheck it and say, hey, wait a minute, this law is not doing a good job and we need to start changing it. And as you say, it might be really, really hard to address with the topic that's taboo or people don't like to talk about it. And so you lose a law. And that's really interesting that even with some of these small changes, it may go under the radar for a lot of people, but maybe it starts to change the culture a little bit. That's very interesting. I would highly recommend the book. I know this is not hard to see it, but Menstruation Matters, Challenging the Law of Silence on Periods. It's really good. I did not get a chance to look through all the back to make sure I picked up every single sort of other nonprofit and website for further reading and resources, but we'll try to gather some more. And when we send out the recording of this, so people can, if they want to kind of get more involved or learn more about what's going on in your own jurisdictions, I definitely, looking at some comments from Lowell, get involved locally, because that's where some of the action and some of the difference can be made, whether it's at your local school to make sure products are available, or through your nonprofit or your employer to make sure products are available and safe, things like that. Any last sort of comments or pitches or thoughts, Bridget and Emily, on this topic, or anything else related?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, and thanks to everyone who joined. We are so grateful for this community and for the work of the YANA network.
It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Keep it up. We'll certainly spread the word. I hope we get some more small victories and that'll lead to some bigger ones down the road. So thanks for joining us on a warm summer evening, and best of luck and stay safe, everyone.